There's nothing quite like the feeling of standing on land your family has farmed for generations, knowing every stone and furrow as well as the lines on your own weathered hands. For Eli Stoltzfus, this Pennsylvania soil held the memories of his father's laughter, his children's first steps, and 47 years of honest, simple living. The storm that came through Lancaster County that September night was the worst anyone could remember. When morning broke, Eli walked out to check his pasture and found a hole where solid ground used to be. What he discovered down in that hidden cellar would change everything he thought he knew about his quiet Amish community. Inside was a perfectly preserved room from the 1940s, filled with government documents and photographs that told a story no one was supposed to find. But the real shock came when Eli saw his own grandfather's name written in those secret files. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rooster's crow came before dawn, as it had every morning for as long as Eli Stoltzfus could remember. At 47, his body moved with the practiced rhythm of a man who had never known any life but farming. His calloused hands reached for his work clothes in the pre-dawn darkness, careful not to wake Sarah, who still slept peacefully beside him after 25 years of marriage. The floorboards of their farmhouse creaked familiar songs beneath his feet as he made his way to the kitchen. This house had sheltered 3 generations of Stoltzfus men, each adding their own repairs and improvements while maintaining the simple, functional design that served their plain lifestyle. The kitchen still held the lingering aroma of yesterday's bread, baked fresh by Sarah's patient hands, using the same recipe her mother had taught her. Through the window, the first pale light of morning revealed the devastation left by the previous night's storm. Trees that had stood for decades lay twisted and broken across the pasture. The chicken coop's roof had been partially torn away, and debris scattered across the barnyard told the story of nature's fury. But it was the gaping hole in the north pasture that drew Eli's attention and made his stomach tighten with concern. The hole hadn't been there when he'd secured the animals the evening before. It appeared to be at least 10 feet across, dark and mysterious in the early morning shadows. In 47 years of working this land, Eli had never seen anything like it. The storm had been fierce, with winds that howled like angry spirits, and rain that fell in sheets so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. But this looked like the earth itself had simply opened up and swallowed a piece of his pasture. "Papa?" The voice belonged to his youngest daughter, Mary, barely 12 years old, with her mother's gentle eyes and the curiosity that marked all children her age. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, her nightgown modest and practical like everything else in their home. "What are you doing up so early, little one?" Eli asked, turning from the window with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The worry about the hole in his pasture gnawed at him, but there was no need to burden a child with adult concerns. "I heard you moving around, and I was worried about the chickens." Mary rubbed her eyes with the back of her small hand. The storm sounded so scary. Eli knelt down to her level, his large hands gentle on her thin shoulders. "The chickens are fine, a little wet and ruffled, but they're safe in what's left of their coop. We'll fix everything that the storm broke, just like we always do." Sarah's footsteps on the stairs announced her arrival. At 44, she still moved with the grace that had caught Eli's attention at a church gathering all those years ago. Her dark hair, now touched with threads of gray, was already pinned back in the traditional style worn by married Amish women. Her dress was deep blue, well made but without ornament, reflecting their community's values of modesty and simplicity. "How bad is it?" she asked, immediately understanding the concern etched across her husband's weathered face. "Bad enough. Trees down, roof damage to the chicken coop." Eli paused, glancing toward Mary before continuing. "There's something else." A hole opened up in the north pasture. "Never seen anything like it." Sarah moved to the window, her sharp eyes taking in the damage visible in the growing daylight. When she spotted the dark opening in the pasture, Her hand instinctively moved to cover her heart, a gesture Eli had seen countless times over the years whenever something troubled her deeply. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of their eldest son, Samuel. At 22, he was built like his father, tall and strong from years of farm work, with the same steady demeanor that marked the Stoltzfus men. His younger brother David, 18 and still growing into his lanky frame, followed close behind. Their third child, Rebecca, 20 years old and recently baptized into the church, appeared moments later with sleep still heavy in her eyes. "Looks like the storm gave us plenty of work to do," Samuel observed, peering out the window at the destruction. His voice carried the practical acceptance that came from growing up in a farming family, where storms and their aftermath were simply part of life's rhythm. "We'll need to check on the neighbors," Sarah said, already mentally organizing the day ahead. "The miller's place sits lower than ours. If we took this much damage, they might have fared worse. This was the way of their community. When trouble struck, neighbors helped neighbors without question or expectation of repayment. It was a system that had sustained the Amish through more than 2 centuries in Lancaster County, through good harvests and lean years, through times of peace and periods when the outside world pressed too closely against their carefully maintained boundaries." Eli nodded, but his gaze kept drifting back to that mysterious hole in his pasture. Something about it bothered him beyond the obvious concern of lost grazing land. The edges looked too clean, too purposeful, as if the earth had been carefully removed rather than torn away by wind and rain. After a breakfast of eggs from their own chickens, him from their smokehouse, and bread Sarah had baked the day before, the family scattered to begin the work of storm cleanup. Samuel and David headed to the barn to assess damage to their farming equipment, while Rebecca helped Mary tend to the frightened chickens. Sarah began sweeping debris from the kitchen porch, her movements efficient and purposeful, but Eli found himself drawn to the mysterious hole in the pasture. As he approached it, walking carefully across the storm-sodden ground, he could see that his initial assessment had been correct. The hole was roughly circular, about 12 feet across at its widest point, and appeared to be quite deep. The edges were surprisingly clean, as if the earth had collapsed into some kind of void beneath the surface. Kneeling at the edge, Eli could make out what appeared to be wooden beams about 8 feet down. His practical farmer's mind immediately went to the possibility of an old root cellar or storm shelter, perhaps built by the previous owners and forgotten over the decades. The Stoltzfus family had owned this land for 60 years, purchased from an English family who had decided to move closer to Philadelphia. It was possible they had left behind structures that time and soil had hidden. "What do you think it is, Papa?" Samuel's voice startled Eli from his examination. His eldest son had finished his assessment of the barn and come to investigate the hole that had captured his father's attention. "Could be an old root cellar," Eli replied, though something in his gut suggested it might be more complicated than that. "Might be we should take a look, see if there's anything down there that could be dangerous." Samuel nodded, understanding immediately. With 4 children and numerous livestock, any unknown hazard on their property needed to be investigated and addressed quickly. "I'll get some rope and a lantern." As Samuel jogged back toward the barn, Eli continued studying the hole. The wooden beams visible at the bottom appeared to be in remarkably good condition for something that had supposedly been buried for decades. Most wood left underground would have rotted away long ago, unless it had been specially treated or protected somehow. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist that had risen from the rain-soaked earth. Other members of their community began appearing on the roads, some on foot and others in their traditional horse-drawn buggies, all heading out to check on neighbors and offer help with storm cleanup. It was a familiar sight after any severe weather. This quiet mobilization of mutual aid that needed no coordination or official organization. Bishop Amos Byler arrived mid-morning, his weathered face grave with concern as he surveyed the damage to the Stoltzfus property. At 73, the bishop had guided their district through countless challenges, his wisdom earned through decades of faithful service to the community. His presence always brought comfort, a reminder that they were part of something larger and more enduring than any individual family's troubles. "The Lord's hand is in all things," Bishop Byler said quietly, standing beside Eli as they looked out over the storm damage. "Even in the storms that test our faith." Eli nodded, though his gaze kept drifting to the hole in the pasture. Something about it troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate, a feeling that went deeper than concern about lost grazing land or the cost of repairs. "There's something else," Eli said finally, leading the bishop toward the mysterious opening. "The storm uncovered this. Looks like it might be an old cellar or something similar." Bishop Byler studied the hole with the same careful attention he brought to all matters affecting their community. After a long moment, he straightened and placed a weathered hand on Eli's shoulder. "Best to know what lies beneath our feet," he said simply. "But be cautious, Eli. Sometimes the past is buried for good reasons." The words carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to the situation, and Eli found himself wondering what the old bishop might know about the history of this land that others had forgotten. By afternoon, with Samuel's help and the blessing of Bishop Byler, Eli had rigged a rope and pulley system that would allow them to safely descend into the hole. The decision to explore had not been made lightly. Their community generally preferred to avoid unnecessary risks, and there were practical concerns about what they might find below. But as the sun began its descent toward evening, and with his family gathered around the edge of the hole to ensure his safety, Eli lowered himself down into the darkness below, carrying a battery-powered lantern that cast dancing shadows on the earthen walls. What he found there would change everything he thought he knew about his family, his land, and the quiet history of Lancaster County. But in that moment, descending slowly into the unknown depths beneath his pasture, Eli Stoltzfus was still just a simple Amish farmer investigating what appeared to be an old root cellar uncovered by a storm. He had no way of knowing that he was about to discover secrets that had been deliberately buried for more than 70 years, or that those secrets would soon draw the attention of people who lived in a world very different from his own. The grandfather's worn Bible that sat on his kitchen table, with its pressed flowers and handwritten margin notes, held clues to a past that Eli had never imagined. But those revelations lay ahead, waiting in the darkness below ground, where wooden beams had preserved more than just empty space. As his feet touched the floor of the hidden chamber, Eli's lantern light fell across objects that had no business being in a simple root cellar. The beam illuminated equipment he didn't recognize, papers that appeared to be official documents, and photographs that showed people he thought he knew in contexts that made no sense. But it was the sight of his own grandfather's name, written in careful script on what appeared to be a government form, that made Eli's hands tremble as he held the lantern higher to better illuminate the impossible scene before him. The first thing Eli noticed was how dry everything was. Despite being buried underground for what must have been decades, the air in the hidden chamber carried none of the musty dampness he would have expected. Instead, it felt strangely preserved, as if time itself had been suspended in this underground space. His lantern beam swept across walls lined with wooden shelving, each shelf holding items that seemed to belong in a different world entirely. There were metal boxes with strange dials and switches, their surfaces still gleaming as if they had been polished yesterday. Stacks of papers sat in neat piles, protected by what appeared to be oiled cloth covers. And everywhere photographs were pinned to boards or filed in careful rows. "Papa, what do you see down there?" Samuel's voice drifted down from above, filled with the curiosity that had marked him even as a child. Eli tried to find words for what lay before him, but everything he saw challenged his understanding of what should be in an old root cellar. "There's equipment down here, Samuel, and papers, lots of papers." He moved deeper into the chamber, his lantern revealing more details with each step. The space was larger than he had expected, extending back into the earth further than his light could reach. Along one wall, a series of maps were still pinned to a wooden board, their surface marked with pins and colored lines that made no immediate sense to him. But it was a particular photograph that stopped him cold. Pinned prominently to the central board was a black and white image of his own grandfather, Jacob Stoltzfus, standing next to two men in suits. The men were clearly English, outsiders to the Amish community, and they appeared to be engaged in serious conversation. His grandfather looked younger in the photograph, probably in his 30s, but there was no mistaking the strong jaw and steady eyes that Eli remembered from his childhood. The photograph made no sense. Eli's grandfather had been a simple farmer, devoted to the plain life and the teachings of their church. He had never spoken of having any connection to the English world beyond the necessary interactions required for selling crops and purchasing supplies. Yet here was clear evidence of some kind of relationship that had never been mentioned in family stories. "Samuel," Eli called up through the opening, "I need you to come down here. But first, make sure your mother and sisters stay back. This isn't something for them to see just yet." The rope creaked as Samuel descended, his movements careful and controlled. When he reached the bottom and took in the scene revealed by Eli's lantern, his sharp intake of breath echoed in the confined space. "What is all this, Papa?" Eli moved to examine more of the photographs, his lantern casting shifting shadows across faces and scenes that told a story he was only beginning to comprehend. Many of the images showed local landmarks he recognized. The covered bridge over Mill Creek, the old schoolhouse, even their own farmhouse as it had appeared decades earlier. But scattered among these familiar scenes were photographs of people engaged in activities that seemed far removed from the simple life of Lancaster County. One metal box caught his attention because it appeared more sophisticated than anything else in the chamber. When he opened it carefully, he found what looked like radio equipment, but more complex than anything he had seen before. Dials and switches covered its face, and coiled wires connected it to what appeared to be some kind of antenna system that disappeared up into the earthen ceiling. "This is radio equipment," Samuel said, his voice filled with wonder. "But why would someone bury a radio station under our pasture?" The question hung in the air as they continued their exploration. File folders revealed documents bearing official seals and stamps, many marked with words like "classified" and "confidential" in bold red letters. The papers were filled with information that meant nothing to either Eli or Samuel, references to assets and intelligence gathering and operational security. But scattered throughout the official documents were handwritten notes in a familiar script. With growing amazement, Eli realized he was looking at his grandfather's handwriting, the same careful penmanship that had filled the margins of the family Bible with pressed flowers and thoughtful observations about Scripture, and also filled pages with what appeared to be reports and observations about their community and its members. One notebook, bound in brown leather and showing signs of frequent use, contained entries that made Eli's stomach clench with discomfort. His grandfather had recorded detailed information about neighbors, noting their habits, their visitors, their conversations. Names Eli recognized from his childhood appeared alongside observations about their activities and associations. "Papa, look at this." Samuel's voice was tight with concern. He held a folder that contained photographs of several local families, including images of Bishop Byler as a much younger man. Each photograph was accompanied by typed notes describing the individual's routines and potential security risks. The implications were staggering. Someone had been conducting surveillance on their community from this hidden station, and that someone had been Eli's own grandfather. The man he remembered as a gentle farmer who told stories by the fireside and helped with difficult carving had apparently been involved in activities that violated everything the Amish believed about separation from the world's conflicts. As they continued examining the contents of the chamber, a clearer picture began to emerge. The dates on the documents spanned the 1940s, corresponding to the years of World War II and its immediate aftermath. The radio equipment appeared designed for long-distance communication, and several maps showed not just local areas, but regions extending far beyond Lancaster County. Most disturbing of all was a metal filing cabinet that contained what appeared to be payment records. Document after document showed financial transactions between Asset J. Stoltzfus and various government agencies. The amounts were substantial, far more than a simple farmer could have earned from his crops alone. "He was working for the government," Samuel said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. Grandfather Jacob was some kind of spy. The word hung in the air between them like an accusation. In their community, where separation from worldly conflicts was a fundamental principle, the idea that one of their own had been secretly involved in government intelligence work was almost incomprehensible. Eli's hands shook as he continued examining documents that painted an increasingly complex picture of his grandfather's activities. Jacob had apparently been recruited sometime in the early 1940s, during the period when concerns about German infiltration and domestic security had reached fever pitch throughout the country. His position within the Amish community had made him valuable as someone who could monitor activities while appearing completely removed from worldly affairs. But the most shocking discovery came when Samuel found a folder labeled with their family name. Inside were detailed profiles of every member of the Stoltzfus family, going back 3 generations, including information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of their private lives. Jacob hadn't just been spying on their community, he had been reporting on his own family. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Eli like a physical burden. Everything he thought he knew about his grandfather, about his family's history, about their place in the community, had been built on a foundation of carefully maintained deception. The man who had taught him to milk cows and repair farm equipment had also been living a double life that could have destroyed the trust that held their community together. "What do we do with this, Papa?" Samuel's question cut through Eli's racing thoughts. "Do we tell the bishop? Do we tell Mama?" Eli looked around the chamber one more time, taking in the evidence of secrets that had been successfully hidden for more than 70 years. The discovery changed everything, but it also raised questions that he wasn't sure he was prepared to answer. How many other people in their community had known about Jacob's activities? Had Bishop Byler's earlier warning about the past being buried for good reasons been more than just general wisdom? And most importantly, what responsibility did Eli have to reveal these secrets, knowing that doing so might damage not just his family's reputation, but the faith and trust that held their entire community together? As they climbed back up to the surface, leaving the 1940s radio equipment and its revelations behind in the darkness, Eli knew that his simple life as a farmer had irrevocably changed. The storm had done more than tear up his pasture. It had unearthed family secrets that would force him to question everything he believed about honor, duty, and the sometimes complicated relationship between protecting those you love and serving a larger cause. But he had no way of knowing that the discovery was just the beginning, or that other people had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment when the buried intelligence station would finally see daylight again. That evening, after the children had been sent to bed and the house had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Eli sat across from Sarah at their kitchen table. The oil lamp between them cast a warm circle of light that seemed to emphasize how the discovery in the cellar had created a barrier between their former life and whatever lay ahead. Sarah's hands rested flat on the worn wooden surface, her wedding ring catching the lamplight. She had been Eli's partner through every challenge their marriage had faced. Difficult harvests, sick children, the death of her parents, the constant balancing act required to maintain their family's place within the community while raising 4 children with distinct personalities and desires. But nothing had prepared either of them for this. "Tell me again what you found," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the concern that had been etched across her features since Eli and Samuel had emerged from the hidden chamber. Eli described the radio equipment, the photographs, the documents bearing his grandfather's name. With each detail, he watched Sarah's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something approaching grief. This was not just about discovering that Jakob had kept secrets. It was about learning that the foundation stories of their family history had been built on carefully maintained lies. The coded notebook was the worst part, Eli continued, pulling the leather-bound journal from where he had hidden it beneath other papers. He wrote down things about our neighbors, about families we've known our whole lives, private things, personal observations that could have... He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Sarah reached for the notebook with trembling fingers. As she opened it and began reading the entries written in Jakob's familiar script, her face grew pale. Here was evidence that the grandfather who had bounced their children on his knee, who had been revered in the community as a man of wisdom and integrity, had been systematically violating the trust that held their world together. The Millers, Sarah whispered, pointing to an entry that detailed their neighbors' financial struggles during the difficult years of the late 1940s. He wrote down that they were 3 months behind on their mortgage. How could he have known that? And why would he record it? The implications were staggering. If Jakob had been reporting on their community members to government handlers, how many families might have suffered consequences they never understood? How many decisions about who was trustworthy or who might pose security risks had been based on information provided by someone they had never suspected? But even more troubling were the entries about their own family. Jakob had recorded details about his son's courtship of Sarah, about private conversations that should have remained within their household, about family disagreements and personal struggles that no outsider should have known. He was reporting on his own son, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. On you, on your mother, on everyone he claimed to love. The weight of betrayal settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Eli had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather's wisdom, his devotion to their community, his unwavering commitment to the principles that guided Amish life. Those stories had shaped Eli's own understanding of what it meant to be a good man, a faithful husband, a responsible member of their community. Now those same stories felt like lies, carefully constructed to hide the truth about a man who had been living 2 completely different lives. What do we do? Sarah asked, closing the notebook as if she couldn't bear to read more. Do we have a responsibility to tell people what we found? It was the question that had been haunting Eli since the moment he first saw his grandfather's name on those government documents. Their community's survival had always depended on trust. Trust that neighbors would help during difficult times. Trust that private conversations would remain private. Trust that leaders could be relied upon to put the community's welfare above their own interests. If word spread that one of their most respected elders had been secretly working for the government, recording private information about his neighbors and family members, the damage to that trust could be irreparable. Some families might never again feel safe sharing their struggles or seeking help. The bonds that had held their community together for generations could be permanently weakened, but keeping the secret also felt wrong. Didn't their neighbors have a right to know that their private lives had been monitored and reported? Didn't the community deserve to understand the truth about someone they had trusted and respected? There's something else, Eli said reluctantly. Some of the documents show that Jakob received money for his work. Substantial payments, more than we ever made from farming. The question is, what did he do with that money? Sarah's eyes widened as she considered the implications. If Jakob had been secretly wealthy, where had the money gone? Had he used it for personal benefit while allowing neighbors to struggle with their own financial difficulties? Or had there been some other purpose for the government payments that they hadn't yet discovered? I need to look through his things again, Sarah said finally. The old trunk in the attic, the papers he left. Maybe there are answers there that will help us understand what really happened. They spent the next hour going through family documents and possessions that had belonged to Jakob, searching for clues that might explain his involvement with government intelligence work. Most of what they found seemed consistent with the simple life of an Amish farmer. Receipts for feed and equipment, correspondence with other family members, records of church activities, but hidden in the back of an old family Bible, pressed between pages, like the dried flowers Sarah remembered from her childhood. They found something that changed everything, a letter written in Jacob's hand, addressed to his son, Eli's father, but never delivered. The letter, dated 1949, was a confession and an explanation. In it, Jacob described how government agents had approached him in 1942, during the darkest days of World War II. They had explained that German infiltrators were attempting to hide among isolationist communities like the Amish, taking advantage of their separation from mainstream American society to establish networks of spies and saboteurs. The agents had asked Jacob to help protect his community by monitoring for signs of infiltration, by watching for strangers who might be posing as converts to their faith, by reporting activities that seemed suspicious or inconsistent with genuine Amish beliefs and practices. "I believed I was protecting you," Jacob had written. "I believed I was serving both my community and my country by helping to identify real threats while shielding innocent people from suspicion and harassment. The money they paid me was never for personal gain. I used every dollar to help families in our district who were struggling, to pay medical bills and mortgage payments and school fees for children whose parents couldn't afford them. I never took a penny for myself." The letter went on to describe Jacob's growing discomfort with his role as his government handlers began asking for more detailed information about community members, including people he knew posed no threat to anyone. He had tried to limit his reports to general observations, but the pressure for more specific intelligence had gradually increased. By the time I understood that I had become trapped in a web of obligations I couldn't escape, it was too late to simply walk away. The letter continued. They made it clear that my cooperation was no longer optional, that refusal to continue would result in consequences for our entire community. I chose to protect you all in the only way I knew how, but I pray that someday you will forgive me for the deception this required. Sarah wiped away tears as she finished reading the letter aloud. The image of Jacob as a traitor began to shift, replaced by a more complex picture of a man caught between impossible choices, trying to protect his family and community while being manipulated by forces beyond his control or understanding. "He was trying to do the right thing," she said softly. "He was trying to protect us," but even this explanation raised new questions. If Jacob had been coerced into continuing his intelligence work against his will, what had finally ended his involvement? How had he managed to escape from obligations that the government had made clear were not optional? And most importantly, why had the intelligence station been abandoned and sealed, leaving all that equipment and those documents to wait in the darkness for more than 70 years? The black sedan appeared on their farm road 3 days after the discovery, moving slowly between the puddles left by the storm. Eli was repairing fence posts damaged by fallen tree limbs when he noticed the vehicle, sleek, government-issued, completely out of place in their rural landscape where horse-drawn buggies were still the primary means of transportation. 2 people emerged from the sedan, a woman in her 50s wearing a dark business suit and a younger man carrying what appeared to be official documentation. They moved with the confident purposefulness of individuals accustomed to having their authority respected without question. Sarah appeared on the front porch, her hands unconsciously smoothing her apron as she watched the strangers approach. The children, sensing something unusual, had gathered near the kitchen window to observe the unprecedented sight of government officials visiting their farm. "Mr. Stoltzfus," the woman spoke first, her voice carrying the clipped professionalism of someone accustomed to dealing with sensitive situations. "I'm Agent Martha Hendricks from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is Agent Collins. We'd like to speak with you about the recent discovery on your property." Eli set down his hammer and walked toward them, his mind racing. How could they possibly know about the hidden chamber? He and Samuel had told no one outside their immediate family about what they had found, and even Bishop Byler knew only that they had discovered what appeared to be an old cellar. "I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to," Eli said carefully, falling back on the natural caution that his community had developed over generations of dealing with outside authorities who sometimes didn't understand or respect their way of life. Agent Hendricks smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Mr. Stoltzfus, we've been monitoring this location for quite some time. The storm damage that revealed the intelligence station didn't go unnoticed. We need to discuss what you found down there, and we need your cooperation to ensure that sensitive materials are handled properly." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. They had been watching his property. They knew about the intelligence station, which meant they had always known about his grandfather's activities, had perhaps been waiting for exactly this moment when the buried secrets would finally surface. "Why don't we go inside and sit down?" Sarah suggested, her voice steady despite the concern Eli could see in her eyes. "I'll put on some coffee." The agents followed them into the house, their trained eyes taking in every detail of the simple Amish lifestyle, the plain furniture, the lack of modern conveniences, the photographs of family members dressed in traditional clothing. Agent Hendricks' gaze lingered on the family Bible that still sat on the kitchen table, its worn cover hiding the letter that had changed their understanding of Jacob's story. Once they were seated around the kitchen table, Agent Hendricks opened a folder and spread several photographs across the wooden surface. Eli's breath caught as he recognized images from the hidden chamber, pictures of the radio equipment, the document files, even the photograph that showed his grandfather with the two government agents. "Your grandfather, Jacob Stoltzfus, was recruited by the Office of Strategic Services in 1942, Agent Hendricks began, her tone businesslike but not unkind. During World War II and the early years of the Cold War, he provided valuable intelligence about potential security threats in this area. His work helped protect both your community and national security interests." "Protected us from what?" Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from reading Jacob's letter. "German infiltrators, initially. Later, concerns about communist agents attempting to establish networks in rural communities that might be sympathetic to isolationist or anti-government sentiments. Your grandfather's position within the Amish community made him uniquely valuable as someone who could identify genuine threats while protecting innocent people from suspicion." Agent Collins, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward slightly. "The intelligence station was abandoned in 1953, when your grandfather's handler retired and the specific operation was concluded. Standard procedure called for the site to be sealed and monitored, but not necessarily excavated unless there was a security concern." "So you've been watching our farm for 70 years? Sarah asked, her voice tight with indignation. "Not actively watching," Agent Hendricks clarified, "but the location remained on our files as a site of historical intelligence interest. When satellite imagery showed the storm damage and the exposed cellar, we were notified automatically." Eli felt a surge of anger at the casual way these strangers discussed his family's private life, his grandfather's secret activities, the monitoring of his property. But beneath the anger was a growing awareness that this conversation was heading somewhere he might not want to go. "What do you want from us?" he asked directly. Agent Hendricks closed the folder and looked directly into his eyes. "We need to examine the contents of the intelligence station thoroughly. There may be materials down there that are still classified, still sensitive from a national security perspective. We also need your assurance that information about your grandfather's activities won't be shared in ways that could compromise other operations or endanger people who might still be at risk." "Are you telling us we have to keep this secret?" Sarah asked. "We're asking for your cooperation," Agent Collins replied. "We understand this situation is difficult for your family. Learning about a relative's involvement in intelligence work is never easy, especially in a community that values separation from worldly affairs. But there are still security considerations that need to be respected. Eli thought about Bishop Byler's warning that the past was sometimes buried for good reasons. Had the old man known more about Jacob's activities than he had revealed? How many other members of their community might have been aware of secrets that had been carefully hidden for decades? There's something else, Agent Hendricks continued. The intelligence station contains equipment and documents that represent significant historical value. There are researchers and historians who would find great interest in preserving this material as part of the record of domestic intelligence operations during the Cold War. Period. You want to turn my grandfather's secret life into a museum exhibit? Eli asked, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. We want to ensure that sensitive materials are handled appropriately, Agent Hendricks replied. But we also recognize that this discovery has created a difficult situation for your family and your community. We're prepared to work with you to find a solution that respects your concerns while meeting our security obligations. As the conversation continued, Eli began to understand that he was being presented with choices that had no clearly right answers. He could cooperate with the government agents and allow them to examine and potentially remove materials from the hidden chamber. He could refuse to cooperate and face the possibility of legal compulsion or continued surveillance. Or he could try to find some middle ground that protected both his family's privacy and legitimate security interests. But lurking beneath all these considerations was a more fundamental question. What did he owe to his grandfather's memory, to his community's trust, to his own family's future? Jacob had made choices that seemed designed to protect the people he loved, even when those choices required deception and secrecy. Now Eli faced the possibility of having to make similar compromises, weighing competing loyalties and trying to navigate between worlds that had very different values and expectations. The photograph collection that Agent Hendricks had shown him included images of community members he had known his entire life, people who had trusted Jacob and who might feel betrayed if they learned about his secret activities. But it also showed evidence of real threats that Jacob had helped to identify and neutralize, genuine dangers that his intelligence work had helped to protect them from. As the agents prepared to leave, promising to return the following day for a more detailed examination of the intelligence station, Eli realized that his simple life as an Amish farmer had become impossibly complicated in ways he never could have imagined. The community meeting was called for the following Sunday evening, after the regular church service had concluded and the families had shared their traditional fellowship meal. Bishop Byler had made the announcement with unusual gravity, requesting that all adult members of their district attend to discuss matters of concern to our community. Eli sat in the back of the miller's barn, where the meeting was being held, feeling the weight of curious and concerned glances from neighbors who had noticed the government sedan parked at his farm. Word traveled quickly in their tight-knit community, and while the specific details of the discovery remained within his family, people knew that something significant had happened at the Stoltzfus farm. Sarah sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed, despite the anxiety that had kept her awake for the past 3 nights. The children had been left at home with Rebecca, who at 20 was old enough to supervise her younger siblings, but still too young to attend the adult community meeting. Bishop Byler stood at the front of the gathering, his weathered face grave as he looked out over the faces of families who had trusted him to guide them through countless challenges over the past 2 decades. At his side stood 2 of the other ministers and several of the community elders, their presence lending additional weight to whatever announcement was about to be made. "Brothers and sisters," Bishop Byler began, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of faithful service. "We have gathered tonight because circumstances have arisen that require our community's wisdom and careful consideration. As you know, the recent storm caused significant damage throughout our area. But it also uncovered something on the Stoltzfus property that affects us all. Eli felt his stomach clench as every eye in the barn turned toward him. He had hoped for more time to process the agent's revelations, to understand the full implications of his grandfather's activities before having to face the judgment of his community. Eli has discovered evidence that during the years of World War II and the period that followed, someone was conducting surveillance activities from a hidden station on his land. The bishop continued. Government agents have confirmed that these activities were part of official intelligence, operations designed to protect our community from infiltration by foreign agents. A murmur of confused voices rippled through the gathering. The idea that their peaceful community had been the target of foreign infiltration seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Most of the families present had lived in Lancaster County for generations, following the same patterns of farming and worship that had sustained their ancestors for more than 2 centuries. The person responsible for these surveillance activities, Bishop Byler said, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation, was Jacob Stoltzfus, Eli's grandfather. The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob had been respected throughout the community, known for his wisdom, his generosity, his commitment to their shared values. The idea that he had been secretly working for the government, monitoring his neighbors and reporting on their activities, seemed to contradict everything people thought they knew about him. David Miller, whose family had been neighbors to the Stoltzfus family for more than 40 years, stood slowly. His weathered face reflected the confusion and concern that Eli could see in every corner of the barn. Bishop, are you saying that Jacob was spying on us? On his own neighbors and family members? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Eli wanted to stand up, to explain about the letter they had found, to share Jacob's own words about trying to protect the community while being trapped in an impossible situation. But he also knew that revealing too much detail might compromise the security. Considerations that Agent Hendricks had emphasized. The evidence suggests that Jacob was trying to protect our community from real threats. Bishop Byler replied carefully, but his methods required him to maintain secrecy about his activities. And this secrecy extended to monitoring and reporting on people he cared about. An elderly woman named Mary Yoder, whose family had suffered through difficult financial times during the 1940s, raised her hand with obvious reluctance. Bishop, some of us received help during those hard years. Anonymous gifts that arrived just when we needed them most. Money left at our doors. Medical bills that were mysteriously paid. We never knew where that help came from. Several other voices joined hers, sharing similar stories of unexpected assistance during times of crisis. Families who had struggled with mortgage payments had found envelopes of cash. Children who needed medical treatment had discovered that their bills had been settled by unknown benefactors. Widows had received firewood and provisions without knowing who had provided them. Eli felt a surge of understanding as he listened to these accounts. Jacob's letter had mentioned using his government payments to help struggling families, but hearing the specific stories brought the reality of his grandfather's dual life into sharp focus. He had been simultaneously reporting on his neighbors and secretly supporting them through their most difficult times. So he was helping people with the money he earned from spying on us. The voice belonged to Samuel Lapp, a man in his 30s whose grandfather had also lived through the wartime years. How do we make sense of that? How do we know what to feel about someone who violated our trust, but also used that violation to serve our needs? It was the question that had been tormenting Eli since he first read Jacob's confession letter. His grandfather had been both betrayer and benefactor, both surveillance operative and community guardian. The moral complexity of his choices defied simple judgment. Bishop Byler raised his hand for silence, his expression thoughtful as he considered how to guide the community through this unprecedented situation. "These are questions that have no easy answers," he said finally. Jacob made choices that went against our principles of separation from worldly conflicts. But he also made choices that served our community's welfare in ways we never recognized or acknowledged. What about now? Asked Martha Byler, the bishop's own daughter-in-law. The government agents who came to Eli's farm, what do they want from us? Are we going to be under suspicion because of what Jacob did all those years ago? Agent Hendricks had been vague about the ongoing implications of the discovery, but her questions and comments had suggested that the investigation might extend beyond simply examining historical documents. The possibility that current community members might face scrutiny because of their connection to Jacob's activities added another layer of concern to an already complex situation. The agents have assured me that their interest is primarily historical, Bishop Byler replied, though Eli detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. They want to examine the materials found in the hidden station and ensure that any sensitive information is handled appropriately. But they have also indicated that our cooperation would be appreciated. The implications of that final statement were clear to everyone present. Government requests for cooperation, even when phrased politely, carried the weight of potential consequences for non-compliance. Their community's long-standing preference for avoiding entanglements with outside authorities was about to be severely tested. As the meeting continued late into the evening, Eli listened to his neighbors struggle with questions that had no clear answers. How should they judge Jacob's actions? What did they owe to his memory? What obligations did they have to cooperate with current government investigations? How could they protect their community's unity while dealing with the divisions that these revelations might create? But perhaps the most troubling question was one that remained unspoken. If Jacob had been recruited to monitor their community for signs of infiltration and subversion, what had the government agents seen in their simple Amish lifestyle that had made such surveillance seem necessary? The media attention began with a single reporter from the Lancaster newspaper who had somehow learned about government agents visiting Amish farms in connection with a Cold War historical investigation. Within 3 days, news vans lined the rural roads surrounding their district, and reporters with cameras and microphones attempted to interview anyone willing to talk about the Amish spy. Scandal! Eli watched from his kitchen window as a television crew set up equipment near the entrance to his farm, their bright lights and electronic equipment creating a scene that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The contrast between their high-tech invasion and the horse-drawn buggy that passed slowly by on the road emphasized how dramatically his quiet life had been disrupted. They're calling it the Amish connection on the morning news, Samuel reported, having heard the coverage while working at a nearby English farm that employed several Amish men during harvest season. They're making it sound like we were all involved in some kind of conspiracy. The media portrayal bore little resemblance to the complex reality that Eli's family was still trying to understand. Television reporters spoke in dramatic tones about secret surveillance networks and Cold War intrigue, reducing Jacob's agonizing moral compromises to sensational headlines designed to capture viewer attention. More troubling was the way the coverage affected their relationships within the community. Some neighbors had begun treating Eli and his family with a distance that hadn't existed before the discovery. Not hostility exactly, but a wariness that suggested trust once given freely would now need to be rebuilt, brick by careful brick. At the same time, other families had approached them with stories that added new dimensions to their understanding of Jacob's activities. Martha Byler had found documents in her deceased father's papers that suggested he had been aware of Jacob's government connections and had actually helped facilitate some of his intelligence work. The revelation that multiple community members might have been involved in or aware of the surveillance operation complicated the narrative of innocent community members being spied upon by a lone operative. I don't understand what they want from us, Sarah said, looking out at the reporters who had been camped near their property for the past week. We didn't ask for any of this attention. We didn't choose to uncover these secrets. But the attention was affecting more than just their daily routines. Rebecca had confided to her mother that some of the young men in their church district were asking uncomfortable questions about whether the Stoltzfus family could be trusted, the possibility that their daughter's prospects for marriage within the community might be damaged by their unwanted connection to government intelligence work added a personal dimension to their concerns. Even more troubling was Samuel's growing fascination with the outside world that the discovery had forced into their lives. He had begun asking questions about the broader context of his great-grandfather's activities, about the historical events that had made such surveillance seem necessary, about the world beyond their rural community that he had never been encouraged to explore. "Papa, Agent Hendricks mentioned that there were other operations like this in other communities," Samuel said during one of their evening conversations. "She said the government recruited assets in Mennonite communities, in rural Catholic areas, even among some Native American tribes. What if there's a whole history of this kind of thing that we've never been told about?" The questions reflected a curiosity that Eli recognized as dangerous to their community's cohesion. Once young people began questioning the boundaries that separated their world from the English world, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the unity and shared values that made their lifestyle possible. Agent Hendricks had returned several times to examine the contents of the intelligence station, each visit accompanied by specialists who photographed and catalogued everything they found. During one of these visits, she had shared information that cast Jacob's activities in an even more complex light. "Your grandfather wasn't just monitoring for foreign infiltrators," she had explained. By 1947, there were concerns about domestic extremist groups attempting to recruit members from isolationist communities. Some of these groups promoted anti-government ideologies that could have led to violence against federal officials or facilities. The government payment records that Eli had found took on new significance in this context. Jacob hadn't just been paid for information about potential foreign threats. He had been compensated for helping to identify and prevent domestic terrorism activities that might have used their community as cover or recruitment grounds. He was protecting us from people who would have exploited our separation from mainstream society for violent purposes, Agent Hendricks had continued. Some of the individuals he helped identify were planning attacks on government buildings, using rural communities as staging areas, because they assumed local residents would be sympathetic to anti-government sentiment. This revelation helped explain some of the more puzzling entries in Jacob's coded notebooks. References to strangers asking too many questions and unusual interest in government facilities made more sense when viewed as reports about potential domestic terrorists rather than simple community gossip. But even this more heroic interpretation of Jacob's activities couldn't resolve the fundamental tension between his surveillance work and the community values he had claimed to serve. He had still violated the trust of neighbors who had confided in him, still reported private information to government handlers, still maintained a secret life that contradicted the principles of honesty and transparency that were supposed to guide Amish relationships. The bishop had called another community meeting to address the growing divisions that the revelations were creating. Some families wanted to formally condemn Jacob's memory and distance themselves from any connection to his activities. Others argued that his intentions had been good and that judging him harshly would be inconsistent with their beliefs about forgiveness and understanding. "The question before us," Bishop Byler had said, "is not whether Jacob made perfect choices. None of us make perfect choices. The question is whether we can find a way to understand his choices while maintaining the unity and trust that our community requires." But unity seemed increasingly elusive as more details emerged about the extent of Jacob's intelligence work. Additional documents found in the station revealed that he had provided information not just about potential security threats, but about community members' personal relationships, financial difficulties, and private conversations. that had nothing to do with national security concerns. Eli found himself caught between defending his grandfather's memory and acknowledging the legitimate concerns of neighbors who felt betrayed by the surveillance. The complexity of trying to honor Jacob's service while respecting the community's need for trust and transparency seemed to grow more difficult with each new revelation. Sarah had begun experiencing what could only be described as a crisis of faith, not in God or their religious beliefs, but in the fundamental assumptions about their community that had shaped her entire adult life. If respected leaders like Jacob could maintain elaborate secret lives, if government agents could recruit assets from among their most trusted members, if their separation from worldly conflicts was more illusory than real, then what other assumptions might prove equally false? "Sometimes I wonder if we've been naive," she confided to Eli one evening after the children had gone to bed. "Maybe the English world has always been more involved in our lives than we wanted to believe. Maybe our separation has been more wishful thinking than actual reality." The questions were troubling because they challenged not just their understanding of the past, but their hopes for their children's future. If the boundaries between their world and the outside world were more porous than they had believed, then the choices they made about education, technology, and community involvement might need to be reconsidered. Most troubling of all was the growing realization that Jacob's story might not be finished. Agent Hendricks had mentioned that some of the materials in the intelligence station were more recent than the 1940s and 1950s, suggesting that the site might have been used by others in the decades since Jacob's original recruitment. The possibility that their land had continued to serve intelligence purposes without their knowledge added yet another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. The discovery that changed everything came on a gray October morning when Eli descended into the intelligence station to retrieve some family documents that Agent Hendricks had requested for her historical analysis. He had made the trip dozens of times over the past month, the route down the rope ladder becoming as familiar as the path to his barn. But this time, something was different. As his lantern illuminated the chamber, Eli noticed that several items had been moved from their original positions. A stack of documents that had been aligned precisely with the edge of a shelf was now slightly askew. The radio equipment, which he had been careful not to disturb, showed signs of recent handling. His first thought was that one of the government agents had made an unauthorized visit, perhaps removing materials without informing him. But as he examined the scene more carefully, he found evidence that made his blood run cold. Hidden behind the original 1940s radio equipment was a second set of devices, modern, electronics with digital displays and sleek plastic casings that belonged to the 21st century. Not the Cold War era. The equipment was sophisticated, clearly expensive, and obviously still functional. Cables ran from the modern devices to what appeared to be a recently installed antenna system that connected to the surface through carefully concealed conduits. Eli's hands trembled as he realized what he was looking at. The intelligence station hadn't been abandoned in 1953, as Agent Hendricks had claimed. Someone had been using this location for surveillance activities that were still ongoing, but the most shocking discovery was yet to come. Taped to the back of the modern radio equipment was a manila envelope containing surveillance photographs that had been taken within the past few months. The images showed Eli and his family going about their daily activities, but they also showed Agent Hendricks and her team examining the contents of the station. Someone had been watching everyone, the Stoltzfus family, the government agents, even the media representatives who had been covering the story. The hidden camera positions revealed in the photographs suggested a level of surveillance that went far beyond casual observation. With growing alarm, Eli found additional evidence of recent activity. a notebook containing entries written in a script he didn't recognize, filled with observations about his family's routines, their visitors, their conversations with government officials. The entries were detailed, professional, and clearly the work of someone with intelligence training. But the entry that made Eli's heart race was dated just 3 days earlier. Target family becoming suspicious. Recommend immediate extraction of assets before security compromise becomes critical. The implications were staggering. Not only had someone been secretly using Jakob's old intelligence station, but they had been monitoring Eli's family and planning some kind of operation that involved extracting valuable materials or information before their activities were discovered. Eli climbed out of the chamber as quickly as his shaking hands would allow, his mind racing with the need to contact Agent Hendricks immediately. But as he emerged into the pale October sunlight, he found Samuel waiting for him with an expression of deep concern. "Papa, there are strangers on the property," Samuel said quietly. "2 men in a pickup truck, parked near the Northfield boundary. They've been watching the house for the past hour." Through the trees that bordered their property, Eli could see the vehicle Samuel had described. 2 figures sat in the cab, and even from this distance, he could tell they were observing the farmhouse through what appeared to be binoculars or other surveillance equipment. "Get your mother and sisters into the house," Eli instructed, trying to keep his voice calm, despite the fear that was building in his chest. "Tell them to stay away from the windows, and send David to get Bishop Byler immediately." As Samuel ran toward the house, Eli considered his options. The modern surveillance equipment in the underground chamber, combined with the presence of unknown observers, suggested that his family had become involved in something far more dangerous than a historical investigation of Cold War intelligence activities. But before he could decide on a course of action, the pickup truck began moving down the farm road toward their house. The 2 occupants were dressed like local farmers, but there was something about their movements and posture that suggested military or law enforcement training. Eli met them in the barnyard, positioning himself between the approaching strangers and his house, where Sarah and the children were hopefully following his instructions to stay hidden. "Good morning," said the driver. A man in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of outdoor work. "We're looking for Eli Stoltzfus. We understand you found some old equipment on your property that might be of interest to collectors." The casual tone didn't match the intensity in the man's eyes, and Eli noticed that his companion remained in the truck with his hand positioned near what might be a concealed weapon. "I'm Eli Stoltzfus," he replied carefully, "but I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you're interested in buying farm equipment, you might try the auction house in town. Actually, we're more interested in communications equipment from the 1940s, the man continued, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Radio gear, antenna systems, maybe some documents that might have historical value. We understand there might be a market for that kind of thing among certain collectors." The reference was too specific to be coincidental. These men knew about the intelligence station, knew about the equipment Jakob had left behind. But their approach suggested they weren't government agents or legitimate researchers. Their interest seemed to be in acquiring materials that might still have current intelligence value. "I think you might have the wrong farm," Eli said, though he could see in the man's expression that the pretense was already wearing thin. "Mr. Stoltzfus, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be," the man replied, his tone shifting from friendly to subtly threatening. "We know about the discovery after the storm. We know government agents have been examining the site, and we know there are materials down there that certain people would pay very well to examine." The reality of the situation became clear to Eli with frightening suddenness. These weren't collectors or researchers. They were foreign operatives, possibly the same people who had been using Jakob's intelligence station for their own surveillance activities. The modern equipment he had found underground wasn't just proof that the site remained active. It was evidence that hostile intelligence services had been operating on American soil, possibly for years. "The thing is," the man continued, Those materials don't really belong to the US government anymore. They belong to people who have been maintaining and improving that facility for quite some time. And those people would very much like to retrieve their property before it gets turned over to the wrong authorities. Eli's mouth went dry as he understood the full scope of what was happening. The storm hadn't just revealed his grandfather's old intelligence station. It had exposed an active foreign surveillance operation that had been using the site as a base for espionage activities against the United States. And now his family was caught in the middle of an international intelligence conflict that had nothing to do with their simple Amish lifestyle and everything to do with the dangerous legacies of secrets that had been buried beneath their peaceful farmland for more than 70 years. The conversation with Agent Hendricks took place in the bishop's house, away from the surveillance that Eli now knew had been monitoring his property for an unknown length of time. Bishop Byler sat quietly in his wooden rocking chair, his weathered hands folded in his lap, while Eli described his discovery of the modern equipment and his encounter with the suspicious visitors. Agent Hendricks listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave as Eli detailed the evidence of ongoing surveillance operations and the foreign operatives' obvious knowledge of the intelligence station's contents. "I need to ask you some questions that are going to be difficult," she said finally. "And I need your absolute honesty, even if the answers might be embarrassing or concerning." Eli nodded, though he could feel the weight of Bishop Byler's attention as the older man evaluated this unprecedented situation. "Have you noticed any unusual activities around your property over the past several years? Strangers who seem to be conducting surveys or inspections? Equipment deliveries that you didn't request? Any signs that people might have been accessing your land without permission?" As Agent Hendricks asked her questions, memories began surfacing that Eli hadn't previously connected to intelligence activities. There had been several occasions over the past few years when he had found evidence that people had been on his property during the night. Tire tracks that hadn't been there the evening before. Gates left open that he was certain he had secured. Even footprints near the location where the intelligence station had later been discovered. "I thought it might be teenagers from town," Eli admitted. "Or maybe hunters who were trespassing. It never occurred to me that someone might be using our land for—" He paused, still struggling to accept the reality of what had been happening beneath his feet. "For espionage activities," Agent Hendricks finished. "Mr. Stoltzfus, what we're dealing with here is a sophisticated foreign intelligence operation that has been using your grandfather's old station as cover for their own surveillance activities. The modern equipment you found represents years of investment and planning." Bishop Byler leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying the authority that had guided their community through countless challenges. "Agent Hendricks, what does this mean for our people? Are we in danger?" "There is potential for danger," she replied honestly. "Foreign intelligence operatives don't usually give up valuable assets without a fight. The fact that they approached Eli directly suggests they're becoming desperate to retrieve whatever materials they consider essential to their operations." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several additional government vehicles, their occupants moving with the purposeful efficiency of people responding to a security crisis. Through the bishop's front window, Eli could see agents setting up communication equipment and establishing what appeared to be a command post. "We're going to need your cooperation for what comes next," Agent Hendricks explained. "We believe the foreign operatives will return to your property, probably tonight, to attempt to retrieve their equipment and destroy evidence of their activities. We need to be ready for them." "You want to use our farm as bait," Bishop Byler observed, his tone neutral, but his concern obvious. "We want to end a foreign intelligence operation that has been violating American sovereignty from a base on your community's land," Agent Hendricks replied. "But yes, that will require using the farm as the location for what we hope will be their final attempt to access the site." Eli felt the weight of another impossible decision. His grandfather had faced similar choices during World War II, forced to choose between his community's preference for separation and his duty to protect them from genuine threats. Now Eli confronted the same dilemma, but with the added burden of knowing how Jacob's choices had affected his relationships with the people he loved. "What would you need from us?" Eli asked. "We need you and your family to maintain your normal routines while our surveillance teams position themselves around the property," Agent Hendricks explained. "We need the foreign operatives to believe they still have the element of surprise. And we need access to the intelligence station so we can monitor their approach and ensure they don't escape with sensitive materials." Over the next several hours, Eli watched his peaceful farm transform into the center of a counterintelligence operation that seemed to belong in a spy novel rather than the rural landscape of Lancaster County. Government agents dressed as local workers positioned themselves in carefully chosen locations around the property. Electronic surveillance equipment was hidden among the farm, buildings and natural features that provided cover for observation. Sarah took the news with the same steady courage she had shown throughout their marriage, though Eli could see the strain in her eyes as she processed the reality that their family had become involved in international espionage activities. "The children need to know enough to follow safety instructions," she said practically, "but not so much that they're frightened beyond their ability to function normally." Rebecca and Mary were told that government agents were conducting a security exercise on the property and that they should stay in the house after dark and follow any instructions they received from their parents immediately and without question. Samuel and David, being older and more mature, received a more complete explanation of the situation and their potential roles in ensuring the operation's success. "This feels like something from a different world," Samuel said as they watched government agents test their communication equipment. "How did our simple life become so complicated?" It was a question Eli had been asking himself repeatedly since the storm first revealed the hidden chamber. But as he considered Jacob's letter and the complex motivations that had driven his grandfather's choices, he began to understand that their life had never been as simple or separate from worldly concerns as they had believed. Sometimes serving the people you love requires making choices that seem to contradict your values, Eli replied.
Your great-grandfather understood that.
Now we have to decide what we're willing to do to protect our community and our country. As evening approached, the government agents retreated to their concealed positions, leaving the farm appearing normal despite the sophisticated surveillance operation that now surrounded it. Eli found himself reflecting on Jacob's hidden journal and the entries that revealed his grandfather's growing discomfort with his intelligence work. "I pray that someday my family will understand that every choice I made was motivated by love," Jacob had written in one of his final entries. "Love for my community, love for my country, love for the principles that make both worth protecting." Now Eli faced the possibility of having to make similar compromises, balancing his community's values against the reality of threats that existed whether or not they chose to acknowledge them. The foreign operatives who had been using their land for surveillance activities represented dangers that could affect not just their small community, but the security of the entire nation. Agent Hendricks had explained that the intelligence station's location made it valuable for monitoring communications and activities throughout the region, including military installations and government facilities that were considered high priority targets for foreign intelligence services. "Your grandfather's old station has become a window into American security operations," she had said. "The foreign operatives have been using it to gather information that could compromise everything from military readiness to diplomatic negotiations." As darkness settled over Lancaster County, Eli positioned himself near a window where he could observe the approach to the intelligence station while remaining hidden from view. Sarah sat nearby, her hands busy with mending work that helped calm her nerves while she waited for whatever was about to unfold. The children had been settled in the back bedrooms, away from windows and positioned where they could be quickly moved to safety if the situation deteriorated. Bishop Beeler had agreed to remain at his own home, but to be available by telephone if spiritual guidance became necessary during the crisis. "Are you afraid?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "Yes," Eli replied honestly. "But I think I understand better now why Grandfather made the choices he did. Sometimes being afraid is just part of doing what's right." The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed with no sign of the foreign operatives, no indication that they intended to attempt retrieval of their equipment. But Agent Hendricks had warned that experienced intelligence operatives might wait until the early morning hours, when surveillance teams would be most likely to experience fatigue and reduced alertness. Shortly after midnight, Eli saw movement in the tree line that bordered the north pasture. Dark figures were approaching the farm, moving with the careful precision of people trained in covert operations. The long-anticipated confrontation was about to begin, and with it would come the resolution of secrets that had been buried beneath Pennsylvania soil for more than 7 decades. The figures moved across Eli's pasture with the fluid precision of professionals who had conducted similar operations many times before. Through the night vision scope that Agent Hendricks had provided, Eli could see 3 individuals dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by tactical gear that looked more military than civilian. They approached the intelligence station with obvious familiarity, moving directly toward the entrance without the hesitation that would be expected from people encountering the site for the first time. One of them produced what appeared to be specialized equipment for rappelling into the chamber, while another began setting up what looked like electronic countermeasures designed to jam any surveillance devices the government agents might have installed. "They've done this before," Eli whispered into the communication device Agent Hendricks had given him. "They know exactly where everything is." "Confirmed," came the reply through his earpiece. "We're observing from multiple positions. Wait for our signal before taking any action." The waiting was excruciating. Eli could see the foreign operatives descending into the chamber where his grandfather's equipment had waited for 70 years to be discovered. But now that same chamber contained modern surveillance gear and classified materials that these intruders were preparing to steal or destroy. Sarah remained at her position near the back of the house, ready to evacuate the children if the operation went wrong. But Eli knew she was also watching through her own window, bearing witness to events that would become part of their family's story for generations to come. The first operative to descend into the chamber remained below for nearly 20 minutes, obviously conducting a thorough examination of the contents and preparing materials for removal. When he emerged, he was carrying a canvas bag that appeared to contain electronic equipment and document files. The second operative descended with what looked like explosive devices, clearly intending to destroy the chamber and eliminate any evidence of their activities. But as he disappeared into the underground space, Agent Hendricks's voice crackled through Eli's earpiece with urgent intensity. "Move now. We're taking them." Floodlights suddenly illuminated the pasture, turning night into brilliant day and catching the foreign operatives in positions that made escape impossible. Government agents emerged from concealed positions throughout the property, their weapons drawn and their commands clear and authoritative. But the response was not the immediate surrender that Eli had hoped for. The operative who remained on the surface drew a weapon and began firing toward the government positions, while shouting commands in a language Eli didn't recognize to his colleagues below ground. The sound of gunfire in his peaceful pasture was surreal, completely alien to everything Eli associated with his home and community. This was the violent world that Jacob had tried to protect them from, now erupting in the place where his children played and his ancestors were buried. "Stay down and stay back," Agent Hendricks commanded through his earpiece. But Eli could see that the situation was becoming more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The operative in the underground chamber had apparently set off some kind of explosive device. because smoke began pouring out of the entrance to the intelligence station. But rather than destroying the facility, the explosion seemed designed to create a diversion that would allow the foreign agents to escape through what must be a secondary exit that the government surveillance teams hadn't discovered. They have an escape tunnel, Eli realized, speaking into his communication device. There must be another way out of the chamber. Even as he spoke, he could see movement in the tree line beyond his pasture, suggesting that at least one of the foreign operatives had indeed escaped through an alternate route. The sophisticated nature of their operation was becoming clear. These weren't desperate criminals attempting a hasty theft, but professional intelligence operatives executing a carefully planned extraction mission. The firefight continued for several more minutes, with government agents attempting to secure the area, while foreign operatives used the smoke and confusion to cover their retreat. But gradually, the tactical superiority of the American forces became evident as they systematically eliminated the intruders' escape options. When the shooting finally stopped, 2 of the foreign operatives were in custody, while the third had apparently escaped through the tunnel system that connected the intelligence station to a concealed exit somewhere in the surrounding woodland. Agent Hendricks appeared at Eli's door, her tactical gear and the weapons she carried, emphasizing how far his simple farming life had become removed from its normal patterns and concerns. "Is everyone in your family safe?" she asked, her professionalism not quite concealing her relief that the immediate crisis had been resolved. "We're fine," Eli replied, though he knew that fine was a relative term for a family whose property had just been the scene of an international intelligence operation and armed confrontation, the original 1940s cipher machine that had drawn the foreign operatives to their property now sat in the hands of government agents who would determine its ultimate fate. But Eli understood that the real significance of the night's events went far beyond the recovery of vintage espionage equipment. The interrogation of the captured foreign operatives revealed the scope of what had been happening beneath Eli's farm for the past decade. The intelligence station that Jacob had established during World War II had been discovered and reactivated by foreign agents in 2015, transformed into a sophisticated surveillance post that monitored military communications throughout the mid-Atlantic region. "They've been operating right under our noses for nearly 10 years, Agent Hendricks explained to Eli and Sarah the following morning, as government teams continued processing evidence from the underground chamber. "Your grandfather's original station provided perfect cover because it was already known to exist in our historical files. No one thought to check whether it might still be active. The revelation cast Jacob's legacy in yet another light. His intelligence work during the 1940s had inadvertently created the infrastructure that foreign operatives would later exploit for their own surveillance activities. The radio equipment and antenna systems he had installed for American intelligence purposes had been upgraded and expanded to serve hostile interests. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came when government investigators found additional documents hidden in the chamber's walls, documents that revealed the full extent of community involvement in Jacob's original operation. Sarah's own grandmother, Martha Byler, had been a willing participant in the intelligence network, using her position as a midwife and herbalist to gather information about strangers who sought medical assistance or asked unusual questions about local families. Her quilting patterns, passed down through generations of women in their community, contained coded information about suspicious activities and potential security threats. "The family quilting pattern that we've been using for decades," Sarah said in amazement, examining photographs that showed how specific stitch combinations conveyed intelligence information. "It's been a code all along." The pattern represented everything that Eli found both admirable and troubling about his grandfather's choices. Jacob hadn't operated alone. He had been part of a network that included trusted community members who shared his commitment to protecting their neighbors from genuine threats. But that network had also required systematic deception, and the violation of trust relationships that were fundamental to their way of life. Bishop Byler arrived as the government teams were completing their evidence collection, his presence bringing a sense of spiritual authority to the resolution of events that had tested their community's unity and faith. "I knew," he said simply, speaking to Eli and Sarah in the quiet privacy of their kitchen while investigators worked outside. "Not the specific details, but I knew that Jacob and others had made sacrifices during the war years to protect us. My own father was part of that network." The confession explained the bishop's earlier warnings about the past being buried for good reasons. He had been carrying the knowledge of community involvement in intelligence activities for decades, balancing his responsibility to preserve their history against his duty to maintain the unity that kept their community together. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sarah asked, her voice reflecting the pain of learning that trusted leaders had maintained secrets that affected her entire understanding of their family's place in the community. "Because the knowledge would have served no useful purpose," Bishop Byler replied. "Jacob and the others made their choices to protect future generations from having to make similar ones. Revealing their sacrifices would have honored their memory, but compromised the peace they died trying to preserve." As the day progressed, more community members came forward with stories and documents that revealed the broader scope of the wartime intelligence network. What had seemed like individual betrayals began to look more like coordinated community service, with trusted leaders making difficult choices to protect their neighbors from threats that most people never knew existed. Samuel, who had been deeply troubled by the discovery of his great-grandfather's surveillance activities, found himself reconsidering his judgment as the fuller story emerged. They were all working together, he said to his father as they watched government vehicles removing the last of the foreign surveillance equipment from their property. Great-grandfather wasn't betraying the community. He was working with community leaders to serve it. The distinction mattered enormously for their understanding of what had happened and what it meant for their future. Jacob hadn't been a lone operative violating community trust for personal gain or government pressure. He had been part of a network of people who shared his commitment to protecting their way of life, even when that protection required them to engage with the violent world they sought to avoid. But the resolution also brought new responsibilities. Agent Hendricks had made it clear that the government would be grateful for continued cooperation in monitoring potential security threats in the region, though she had been careful to emphasize that such cooperation would be entirely voluntary. Your community's position provides unique advantages for observing activities that might threaten national security, she had explained. But any future cooperation would be conducted with full transparency and community consent, unlike the secrecy that was necessary during your grandfather's era. The offer represented another choice between separation and service, another opportunity for the community to balance its values against its responsibilities to the larger society they lived within, but tried to remain apart from. 6 months later, the sinkhole that had started everything had been filled and replanted, leaving no visible trace of the intelligence station that had operated beneath Eli's pasture for nearly 8 decades. The media attention had moved on to other stories, and the government agents had completed their investigation and departed. But the changes to Eli's understanding of his family and community would last much longer than the physical evidence of what they had discovered. The morning sun cast familiar shadows across the barnyard as Eli completed his daily chores, the routine as comforting now as it had been throughout his adult life. But there was a depth to his appreciation for the simple rhythms of farming that hadn't existed before the storm revealed the secrets buried beneath his feet. Sarah emerged from the house carrying a new family Bible, a gift from Agent Hendricks that contained pressed flowers from the site where the intelligence station had been located. It was a gesture that seemed to bridge the gap between their traditional ways and the modern world they had been forced to engage with, honoring both their peaceful intentions and their service to larger purposes. "The children are asking about the story again," Sarah said, settling beside Eli on the front porch where they had shared countless conversations over the years of their marriage. "Mary wants to know if great-grandfather Jacob was a hero or a villain." It was a question that Eli had wrestled with throughout the long months of investigation and community healing that had followed the discovery. The answer seemed to change depending on which aspects of Jacob's choices you emphasized, which values you considered most important, which consequences you judged most significant. "I think he was a man who tried to do right by the people he loved," Eli replied finally. "Sometimes that meant making choices that looked wrong from the outside, but that served purposes larger than himself." Samuel appeared around the corner of the barn, no longer the young man who had been questioning the boundaries of their community 6 months earlier. The events surrounding the intelligence station had given him a new appreciation for the complexity of the choices their community faced in maintaining their separation from worldly conflicts while still fulfilling their responsibilities as citizens and neighbors. "Agent Hendricks called this morning," Samuel reported. "The government wants to hold a ceremony recognizing grandfather Jacob and the others who served during the war years. They're calling it a civilian service recognition event." The offer represented both an honor and a challenge. Official recognition of their community members' wartime service would validate the sacrifices that Jacob and his network had made to protect their neighbors. But it would also make public something that had been deliberately kept secret, potentially creating new pressures and expectations for their community's relationship with government authorities. "What did you tell her?" Sarah asked. "I said we'd discuss it with the bishop and the community," Samuel replied. "But I also said that any recognition would need to respect our values about humility and service." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bishop Byler, who had taken to making regular visits to check on the Stoltzfus family's adjustment to their unwanted fame and the complex revelations about their family history. At 73, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his presence still brought the comfort of spiritual wisdom earned through decades of faithful service. "I've been thinking about Samuel's question regarding the government ceremony," the bishop said, settling into the rocking chair that Eli kept on the porch for such visits. "It seems to me that the real question is not whether Jacob deserves recognition, but whether recognition serves the purposes he was trying to achieve." It was the kind of thoughtful reframing that had helped their community navigate the challenges of the past 6 months. Rather than getting caught up in judgments about past actions, Bishop Byler consistently encouraged them to focus on current responsibilities and future opportunities to serve their neighbors and their principles. Jacob's network worked in secret because secrecy was necessary for their effectiveness, the bishop continued. But perhaps transparency is what's needed now, to help other communities understand that service and sacrifice can take many forms. The discussion reflected a broader conversation that had been taking place throughout their district as families processed the revelations about wartime intelligence, activities and their implications for current relationships with government authorities. Some members favored a return to strict separation from worldly affairs, while others argued that their community's unique position created opportunities to serve larger purposes while maintaining their essential values. Rebecca, now 21 and preparing for baptism into full church membership, had surprised everyone by expressing interest in the broader historical context of her great-grandfather's activities. She had begun corresponding with historians and researchers who were documenting civilian intelligence networks during World War II, contributing family stories and documents that helped illuminate a largely unknown aspect of wartime homefront activities. "I think great-grandfather would want his story to be told truthfully," she had said during one of their family discussions. not to glorify what he did, but to help people understand that ordinary citizens sometimes face extraordinary choices. David, now 19 and working full-time on the family farm, had developed a new appreciation for the complexity of the adult world that he would soon be fully joining. The discovery had matured him in ways that normal farming life might not have accomplished, giving him a deeper understanding of the difficult balances that adults must maintain between competing loyalties and responsibilities. Mary, still 12, but no longer quite as innocent as she had been before the storm, had taken to asking thoughtful questions about the relationship between their community and the larger society they lived within. Her curiosity suggested that the next generation would face their own challenges in defining what separation from worldly conflicts could mean in an increasingly connected world. Agent Hendricks had kept her, promised to maintain contact with the family, though her visits had become more social than professional as the immediate security concerns were resolved. During her most recent visit, she had shared information about how the foreign surveillance operation had been completely dismantled, with arrests made in 3 different countries and intelligence networks disrupted throughout North America. Your willingness to cooperate made the difference, she had told Eli. Without access to that intelligence station and the information it contained, we might never have identified the full scope of their activities. The gratitude was genuine, but it also carried implications for the future. The government's appreciation for their community's assistance would likely lead to future requests for cooperation, creating ongoing challenges in maintaining their preferred separation from worldly conflicts. As the sun set over Lancaster County that evening, painting the familiar landscape in the golden light that Eli had loved since childhood, he reflected on how the storm had changed everything, while somehow leaving the essentials unchanged. His family still farmed the same land, still followed the same seasonal rhythms, still gathered around the same kitchen table for meals and conversation. But they now carried a deeper understanding of how their peaceful community was connected to the larger world, how their ancestors had made sacrifices to protect the freedom they enjoyed, and how current generations might be called to make their own contributions to causes larger than themselves. The new family Bible sat open on the kitchen table, its pages containing both traditional scripture passages and the pressed flowers that represented their family's unique service to both their community and their country. It was a symbol of how the past and present could be honored together, how secrets could be transformed into wisdom, and how the simple life they cherished could coexist with responsibilities to the complex world that surrounded them. As Eli turned out the oil lamp and prepared for sleep, he offered a prayer of gratitude for his grandfather's courage, for his community's forgiveness, for his family's unity, and for the peaceful morning that would dawn tomorrow over the Pennsylvania farmland, where both secrets and service had found their proper place in the continuing story of people who chose to live simply in a complicated world. The storm had passed, but its revelations would continue shaping their understanding of what it meant to be faithful stewards of the land, the community, and the larger purposes that give meaning to ordinary lives lived with extraordinary commitment to doing what's right, even when the definition of right required wisdom that could only come from experience, prayer, and the patient counsel of neighbors who shared the burden of making difficult choices in service of enduring values.